Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by Rauli Partanen, an award-winning writer and science communicator based in Finland. Rauli is the author of a number of books, including Finland After Oil, Climate Gamble, How Anti-Nuclear Activism is Endangering Our Future, Dark Horse, Nuclear Power and Climate Change. Rauli is also the co-founder of the Eco-Modernist Society of Finland and a non-profit think tank called Think Atom. Rauli, there's a certain theme I'm seeing kind of weaving its way through your work. Welcome to Decouple. This theme is welcome on this podcast.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me.
Okay, Rauli. So we're bringing you on to talk about a recent report that you co-authored with Olli. Anyway, we'll credit Olli as well in a second here. Yes, Olli Sopela. Wonderful.
Olli Sopela.
Each got our copy here. But first, my friend, as you know, we like the self-introductions here. So I got kind of your bibliography out of the way, but tell us a little about yourself. I understand we're recording early my time because you have some capoeira to go teach in an hour and a half or something. But just, tell us a little something about yourself. Make yourself relatable to the Decouple audience.
Oh God, I hate self-introductions. I'm really bad at them. But yeah, I've been doing capoeira for 20 years. I teach a local club in a city nearby. I have 3 kids. The youngest is 7. She's a princess. Then the middle one is 12, and the oldest one is 15. So quite a spread. Interesting life. The oldest one also goes to capoeira with me, which is nice. Nice as well.
We are, Decouple podcast has grown into Decouple Media. We have a whole variety of products now in the Decouple Media line, but one of them is backflips for nuclear, which is or Decouple Acrobatics, which is headed up by Dylan Moon. He did some pretty awesome moves in Berlin.
Yeah, I saw those
at the big rally. So I'm we also have, I think it's Eduardo Kwok. I hope I'm getting his name right. Who was the breakdancer featured in the Net Zero Needs Nuclear, what do you call it again? Flash mob dance thing in Glasgow. So, wondering if I can recruit you onto some kind of decouple acrobatics with the capoeira.
Handstands for nuclear.
Beautiful. All right. All right. You've been recruited. And the decouple team grows. Okay. All that aside, let's jump in a little bit. Again, this 1 billion tons report. I met you, Rauli. I had the pleasure of meeting you in person in Glasgow, and we got to do like a mini interview about it. But it was I think you had to like race to the airport a few minutes after we recorded, or it's all a blur. It was.
I had to race to the bed to get some sleep before racing to the airport.
It was quite a sort of like sleep deprived week we had there, so it's a bit of a blur. But the German 6, the first 3 plants are scheduled to come offline. Is it on New Year's Eve or? Is that right?
Well, somewhere around there, at the end of the year.
They had to get the first 3 off by the end of 2021 for some reason. So I think it's by New Year's Eve, and then the next 3 are coming off by the end of 2022. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Okay. And this was also the context of the James Hansen interview on Decouple, where Edinburgh Gates, organized by Stand Up for Nuclear and FOTA for Climate. So it's big in the news. Thought it was quite topical. We're in December, and within the next 3 weeks, a bunch of German nuclear comes offline. So let's talk about the consequences of that. But first, let's kind of situate things a little bit historically. We have done an episode. God, I think it was episode number 2 with Matthias Beckers, framing the Energiewende a little bit. But let's reframe it, for those listeners that are jumping in 104 episodes later.
Good work.
Just give us a little bit of the context again for the Energiewende, its goals and how it's going.
Well, I mean, it started about at the turn of the century, really, with the negotiations in government, and then of course they all also had to negotiate with the industry about the closure of the nuclear power plants and going all in on renewable energy. Then, well, they set some of the most progressive renewable energy legislation in Germany at the time on a global scene. Then about 10 years later, Merkel had the power, and she actually signed a new law or act that the nuclear plants could operate longer than
And
the.
Merkel's a quantum chemist, I believe. Like she's kind of a
Yeah,
respected
she's pretty
scientist
well
in her own way.
educated on
Yeah.
these topics, and she was citing the climate, like emission reductions, as one of the main kind of arguments for keeping the nuclear power plants open. And this was around the time 2010 turned to 2011, something like that. And she had the legislation, and basically the ink didn't have time to dry when a certain tsunami and earthquake happened on the other side of the globe, and that caused the political situation in Germany to go in a way. They had obviously there's always elections coming, and the Greens were having some good headway in the coming elections, and obviously they were using this as one of their campaigning tools. So Merkel at least felt, I'm not sure what would have been the actual reality had she not done it, but she felt that she had to kind of fight back, and a couple of days after the accident ordered some of the units to be closed, and cancelled the whole kind of cancelling of the Atomausstieg,
And I
as
mean,
they say.
outside of Japan, where it's a little more understandable that they kind of scrammed their whole fleet and have kept things offline for a while. I mean, understandable, but they've also had a lot of extra fossil fuel bills and been burning a
Right.
ridiculous amount of coal and gas. But I mean, Germany's a long ways away. Not really any active tsunami zones. I guess a pretty sterling record of nuclear safety. Like in terms of you've been in this field for a while. You've been in Germany studying Germany as part of your work as an energy analyst. Like what do you think it is about the German psyche that led to this kind of a reaction? Like I think really there's again lots of countries that said, hey, we're going to take a little pause on nuclear, like China, big safety reevaluations around the world, but it was Germany and Japan that had this kind of reaction. So what is it about Germany and the German people and the German psyche that you think led to that pretty extraordinary policy decision?
Well, that is a good question, and it would be a good thing to study for an army of psychologists and perhaps even psychotherapists. I guess it starts, well, the German culture and the nature of German people, they're quite romantic, and nature kind of, even though they're brilliant engineers and scientists, they also have this other side of being very kind of nature and love homeopathy and stuff like that, which is like completely weird for me. But here you are. So they have that as a backdrop. And then after Second World War, during the Cold War, they were in the kind of very literally in the front line of getting the nukes, basically, if something went wrong. You had East Germany, West Germany, and all that stuff. So I think that has been for a generation of Germans a very kind of traumatizing and scary time. And then it started to kind of feed on itself, and in the last decades, the kind of whole German society has become through and through kind of anti-nuclear. You teach it in the kindergarten, you teach it at school. You have many institutions and research institutes and whatever who repeat this message that nuclear is bad, nuclear is dangerous, nuclear is this and that. So you kind of get marinated in the message your whole life. And even if you disagree, we know that there's a lot of German people who think nuclear is quite fine and okay. But if the whole society is saying that it's bad, it takes a lot of courage, or you have to be dumb in some way to kind of come out and say that, no, I actually like nuclear and we should do it and build more of it, because you risk your whole career, your whole social life, at least. And even if you wouldn't, there is a perception that you will. So it's much easier to just stay silent. So the only ones who are actually saying anything are the people who are anti-nuclear by profession or by desire.
There's an interesting phenomena in medicine, my field, where pharmaceutical representatives will come by your office and bring you some token gifts. And so there's some research into, are we influenced by that or not? And when you talk to doctors, they'll say, "Oh, I'm not influenced by it, but my colleagues for sure," right? And I've heard similar things in terms of when Germans are asked about nuclear energy. Generally speaking, they say, "Oh, like I'm not against it," but they overestimate how against it their neighbors are, the rest of the community is, and I think that has, as you were saying, a real impact of kind of maybe censorship's the wrong word, self-censorship, or just misperception. I think like polling as a phenomenon is just such an important way to get a sense of what the popular opinions are, and without that mirror shining back on you, it can maybe distort your perception of where your politics fit or where your ideas fit.
Right.
I have heard that there have been some polls recently that did show that a majority of Germans are at least open to the idea of keeping the German remaining reactors open in the context of climate change. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's what I've been seeing. Obviously, there must be many kinds of polls, and you always need to check out how the questions are formulated, because from that you get very different answers. But yeah, I've seen those polls as well, especially if you give the context of climate to the nuclear issue, then the response is quite different than when you compare, would you like to have solar electricity or nuclear electricity? Like, yeah, well, if it works and if it's cheap, then solar. But if you don't give any context, yeah.
Interesting. It was, yeah, I mean, just anecdotally, participating at the rally in Berlin, like, it was staggering. I was dressed in my scrubs, big friendly face. I'm pretty extroverted, pretty able to just start random conversations with people. And I was even juggling, like I was just pulling out all the stops, trying to,
Right.
warm up some German bystanders and passersby to just even have a conversation, right? So I was like juggling and walking and talking at the same time, trying to start a conversation with some people, and my success rate was, I think, 0 for 30 in terms of like conversations with Germans. And then I had, a bunch of success with tourists that were passing by the Brandenburg gates, but it was wild, just
Wow.
like how closed off that was. And I know that again is a very imperfect polling methodology, but it was, it's just 9. Would you talk about anything else related to energy? 9. It was pretty wild. It was pretty wild.
Yeah. And I think if you want to take the kind of anti-nuclear organizations and professionals into this, I think that they know this, and especially with like famous people or politicians or people that a lot of people know. I think that if some of them would come out and say something positive about nuclear, these people would attack them and make them kind of pay. And you see it on Twitter all the time. So this kind of increases the cost of coming out even further. And yeah, it's a cynical view, but I think it's also correct.
I think it's entirely accurate, and it's kind of the counter impact of what I'll call the Isabel Bemeke effect,
Right?
Right, where someone who's an influencer and has a certain degree of fame and charisma comes out like this and is a sole voice, and maybe people think she's kind of crazy or an oddball, but people are curious, and now in the aftermath of the clean energy rally in California, there's this kind of domino effect of influencers and very famous people coming out pro-nuclear, and that includes Elon Musk himself. I mean, it was a little bit of there was a bit of a hedge there, but saying we shouldn't close nuclear plants unless there's some overwhelming risks from things. And then I guess his ex Grimes and a number of other noteworthy people are really coming out of the woodwork now to I guess endorse at least keeping nuclear open. So that's interesting, and I do feel like we're in this historic moment where the dam is breaking. Like the anti-nuclear establishment has been able to kind of keep pro-nuclear voices out or make it socially costly, as you're saying, for people to speak their mind and their opinions, and that is starting to change. Maybe not fast enough to save these German six. So let's talk a little bit about this context here. So Germany historically had much more nuclear around. Tell us about sort of what there was, what there is now, and how what there is now compares to the other sources on the grid.
Oh dear, do I even remember? I think they had something like 17 reactors.
I just read it, so I mean,
Yeah,
it was 25.
yeah, the report doesn't mention.
Right, not the numbers, but I guess.
Yeah,
it's hilarious. So I one of the
17.
critiques I get a lot on the podcast is I like answer the question that I'm asking for my guests because I'm just so nerdy and maybe want to show off that I've done my research. But what I was reading in the report was it used to be 25% of all German electricity was nuclear, right? And that's dropped significantly.
Well, obviously, if you take about 2/3 of it offline, then much less.
So something the report was saying it's the remaining nuclear, if we take it off the grid, is the equivalent of, I guess, in terms of yearly production of taking all of German solar offline or 15,000 wind turbines.
Yeah, something like that. It's about 8 gigawatts, if I remember right. That's about the size of the Finnish electricity grid.
Wow!
Like the whole, it's like, man. We have a lot of discussion here in Finland about climate, and we have one of the most progressive climate legislation. Like, we have a target of becoming carbon neutral by 2035.
Wow!
And obviously, there's a lot of discussion about sacrifices and investments and how should we do it and stuff like that. I actually just got a report out last week where I studied the kind of opportunity to do it with mostly nuclear. I'm sorry, it's only in Finnish, but I will see if I can get a translated version for you to look at. But the thing is that, all of this discussion, all of this kind of work and political stuff, and then we have a neighboring country who just decides to flush it down the toilet, kind of like, none of our stuff kind of matters if you do this.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a certainly potent example. But the other one that came up recently in the context of Germany's efforts to defund fossil fuel development in very poor countries while continuing to burn lots of coal, our backflips for nuclear, team lead, as well as one of our analysts here at Decouple, the jack of all trades, Mr. Dylan Moon, just did a quick calculation of the terawatt hours produced by the German six and comparing that to total electricity production. Like, as you were saying, it's kind of equal to Finland, but it was equal to, in terms of countries in energy poverty, I think it was Nigeria plus Kenya plus Ghana plus another African country. So it's just the consequence of taking this clean energy offline. Not only does it set back Germany, but it's just when you compare it to other smaller countries in the world. I mean, Germany's, I think, the sixth largest economy in the world or something. I mean, it's just...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big one.
It's pretty wild. It's pretty wild. So, in terms of German progress on emissions to date, how are things going with the Energiewende? My understanding of renewables and the deployment of wind and solar in Germany is that, like, there have been emissions reductions. They've been pretty modest, and in terms of how I understand that, it's that these particular resources, because they're intermittent, function as fossil fuel sparers, but not replacements for fossil fuels. So anyway, way too much context yet again from my interview style, but but how is the Energiewende going in terms of the emissions reduction goals?
Well, there's a couple ways you can look at it. One is the context and the time scale that you choose, which is very important. Because, for example, if we compare it to 1990 levels, like what has happened, then you have the one-time event of the reunification of Germany and the subsequent closing down of much of their kind of polluting, inefficient power plants and industry in the East German. So that reduced, like, in a 4-year period, like over 100 million tons of CO2 emissions. So that's a big impact that has nothing to do with the Energiewende, because it happened before and it's a one-time event. Then
Sure.
if you also calculate or say the year 2020, which was last year, so there was this, like, I think it was about 70 million tons reduction, but that was largely due to COVID. So that's also a one-time event, and probably that's going to bounce back if and when the economy starts humming again and people start to move and do stuff. So even though Germany has reduced emissions roughly at the same pace as European Union nations together, there are these events, and you would actually imagine that they would do a little bit better because they've been pouring hundreds and hundreds of billions of euros into their project, while many of the other European nations have not kind of made this kind of similar stuff. And you could, I once did a quick calculation what would happen. Would Germany be able to meet its 2020 emissions reductions targets? Well, they were able to hit them, but that was because COVID. But if they had closed down coal plants instead of nuclear, then somewhat ironically, they would have met those targets. So the very existence of Energiewende as a nuclear closure program is also the cause of the other part of Energiewende, which is the emissions reductions program, to fail. So it's like the famous snake eating its own tail or something like that. It's kind of written in a way that it will cause itself to fail. This is a bit, yeah, that's Energiewende for you.
Now, we talk a lot, I think, in energy transition circles about, what's the low-hanging fruit of decarbonization. And so in terms of, what's easier to do, and I think generally there's a consensus that electricity is kind of one of the easiest things to do, certainly in comparison to things like transportation, and then more difficult things like, I guess, the holy grail of at scale decarbonizing things like fertilizer production or cement and steel. But in terms of progress so far, does Germany follow that story of they've kind of done the easy stuff? It's about to get a lot harder, or what's your thinking on that?
I wish that they would have done even the easy stuff, but
right.
But yeah, that's the
easy stuff
thing.
Being just not shutting down your nuclear plants.
We have multiple ways of making relatively cheap, clean, low carbon electricity. And so from that follows that, yeah, decarbonizing electricity, replacing coal and gas and oil burners with these things is a kind of easy hanging fruit. Then there is this kind of winter, summer variation and how to make it economically feasible to have the extra capacity and all that kind of stuff that hits the last 20 or 10% of the, but anyway, most of the electricity grid is easy to decarbonize. But then you get into these things that like fossil fuels in transportation or industrial processes. If you want to have process steam at 500 degrees Celsius or 1000 degrees Celsius, there is not that many ways that you can do that locally in a reliable and affordable ways. Burning natural gas is one of those, one of the kind of most obvious and easiest and stuff like that. But carbon emissions, we were supposed to decarbonize. So okay, then you have electricity that you can turn into heat, but that's not really cost effective because losses, electricity is more valuable than heat and all this kind of stuff. So these things are really hard to decarbonize and can be much more expensive than just decarbonizing the electricity grid, which is like a third or a quarter of the overall emissions, depending if you calculate only energy or everything. Or transportation fuels. I mean, liquid fuels are very, very useful. That's why we use them so much for transportation. They're easy to store, easy to transfer, easy have a high energy density, easy to burn. So there's a reason we use them. Replacing them with something else is hard. I mean, yeah, I'm all for EVs, like electric vehicles, especially for personal transportation, but they also have their bottlenecks like minerals, materials, production capacity for batteries and components and all that kind of stuff that's gonna take time. So yeah, electricity is easy, and heat and fuels is really hard.
I imagine, like, I had some friends that did a bike tour in Germany, and they were just like, I mean, you see it. There's energy infrastructure everywhere in terms of solar farms and wind turbines and things, and obviously you start to bump into. I think the most recent coalition government talks mentioned that part of the plan to sort of speed up the Energiewende was to dedicate 2% of German land area to renewable energy production. It seems like I just had Hannah Bloomfield on, who's a energy meteorologist. So her whole field is looking at historic meteorological data and future predictions and helping renewable energy projects on where's the best siting, for instance. So I imagine in Germany they've just like we talk about hydroelectricity being a bit limited now because we've picked the best sites. I think with wind and solar, it's a little less clear cut, but certainly, the best sites from the perspective of having, your mountain ridges or whatever, but also the easiest sites in terms of the not in my backyard people. Is Germany starting to run into some issues there in terms of people not wanting infrastructure close to them or the transmission lines? What's your read there?
Yes, very short answer. And something that worries me about this is the thing is that when you have these scenarios and roadmaps for all renewables the future, it pretty much never discusses or takes this argument into account that you might run into deployment problems. Like when you start to deploy infrastructure at very large scale, things start to happen. People suddenly don't want another windmill or another solar park or transmission line next to their house, and they start to push back. And the thing is that if you don't take these into account, you just imagine, or your model imagines that it can deploy and deploy and deploy, and there is no problems, and all of those capacities are at near perfect sites. Then it's, I think to put it in a very nice way is that's a very risky assumption to make, because we are already seeing more and more opposition for this kind of I guess you call it energy sprawl, where it comes into your backyard a little bit too much. I mean, wind power usually is fine for people, especially if it's somewhere else. I mean, and that goes for most energy infrastructure. Obviously, you can have and should have probably solar panels on your rooftops, because there is no alternative cost for having a roof made of solar panels or something else. But when you start cutting down forests or taking land into that use, then you have an alternative cost that you should consider. And it's an ecological issue and it's a social issue for people. I wouldn't want to have my kind of daily walking route destroyed and made into completely something else.
There was it's been making the rounds on Twitter recently, but an Australian photographer who was quite supportive of renewable energy. I think he took some really amazing photos of the trucks moving the huge wind turbine blades. And I think he took them with a drone. Like it's really kind of crazy, like watching a truck with like a 70-meter blade making a turn in an intersection. So these photos he took early on kind of went viral. So the company's like, hey, come and photograph us building the project. It's super cool. And he did, and he started to really see that the environmental impacts are pretty big, because if you're transporting a 70-meter blade, a wind turbine blade, and you're having to move through kind of some mountainous terrain, like the roads you need to cut to move the towers and the blades to the installation site, they need to be really wide, like 50-meter wide roads in some places, right? So anyway, he started photographing, this site and then several other sites, and it really I think it just made him aware of the energy impacts, because I think the way that the marketing for wind and solar has gone, there's really a perception that they kind of fit into a pristine landscape. But when you see those aerial photos of like the kind of roads that need to be built to bring the gear to each of the sites, it's pretty impressive. But the other thing you mentioned is kind of the modeling, and I just not to get too gossipy, but I've had like a very, very mini kind of interaction with Jesse Jenkins, and been referred to lots of peer-reviewed models. And I think there's, real importance to modeling. It's a way to predict the future, but I think there's this incredible hubris that and sort of religious faith placed in models. And you just identified one of the things that modeling may run into in terms of community opposition, in terms of kind of rates of deployment. An Excel spreadsheet doesn't quite model out all the variables that could affect things. But so I very much prefer to base a lot of my analysis in sort of what's happening now, the evidence we have, historical. Obviously, we need to predict the future. I'm not saying models aren't important, but I think what you're saying there is really key. So we've kind of we've hit the context. There's one other thing I wanted before we get into your kind of scenarios that you looked at, and that's the phenomenon of negatively priced hours and subsidies. So because I think this is another barrier that's coming up to ongoing deployment. We mentioned the easy to do stuff. I guess the first 10-20% of putting renewables on the grid is also economically easier. So explain to us a little bit, and particularly to me with my kind of innumeracy and poor sense of economics, this concept of negatively priced hours and its consequences.
Yeah, well, it's a growing phenomenon, and it's largely due to intermittent energy sources like wind and solar installations growing. So the basic idea is that in the power markets, you price electricity regarding the demand and supply at any given hour. And if there is more supply than demand, then the price goes down at any given price point. But then when you start to have large shares of, for example, wind, if you have so much wind that on a very windy day, it can by itself that make all of the needed power. And further, if that wind is already subsidized somewhere, so it gets paid no matter the value on the marketplace, then any production above that actually becomes a waste product that you have to pay to get rid of. So then you are in a situation where the wind installments get paid because they have a subsidy or feed-in tariff or something like that in place that they get paid anyway. But then everything else that tries to go into the market at that point is a waste product that they actually have to pay for somebody to take that. And the amount of these hours in the electricity grid of Europe has been growing at an exponential curve that we have in the study. Yet the deployment of wind and solar in Europe has been growing in a linear curve for the last, let's say, 10 years or so. So there lies the problem that at some point the exponential curve just becomes very exponential and you run into very serious trouble for the whole grid because and the thing is that for the renewables investors, they don't see this problem because it's masked. It's hidden by the feed-in tariff or something like that. They get paid, fine. But nobody else gets paid, so nobody else will be able to make investments that the grid needs. Because there comes the day or week or even a month that there's very little wind and you need everything else to ramp up. But will that capacity be there and will it be enough? Will it be, if they only get paid a certain amount of hours in a year, it's not worthwhile for them to kind of build more capacity or keep it online and ready. So then you run into, people come up with capacity markets. So you start to pay the natural gas plant owner just for keeping the gas plant ready to go when the wind dies down. So then you're paying another subsidy because you're paying the first subsidy kind of thing. You're paying because you're paying. And when you have that actually helps further push reliable, like spaceload power supply off of the market because now the natural gas plant operator can sell its product at a cheaper price because most of their profit or revenue comes from the capacity market payment. You get?
Wow.
So they can outcompete the baseload providers, which further makes the situation worse. yeah, it's unfolding as we speak, I guess, in the European energy crisis.
Yeah, no, that's wild to hear about. As a sort of, I won't call myself a recovering lefty because I still have a lot of left values. I'm just a little bit disgusted with a lot of what I'm seeing around me in terms of the new left or the modern expressions of the left. But in terms of an appreciation for markets, certainly a lot of resistance on my part to free market fundamentalism. But I think this subsidy is creating a market distortion. I think what you're saying is that without the FIT, the market would naturally say, okay, that's enough wind right now, and the investors wouldn't get a return, so they wouldn't build so much more. So this is leading to a famous market distortion scenario. Okay, so let's move a little bit more into your scenarios. I just was dumping on modeling, and now we're going to talk about modeling. So, So tell me about the kind of you mapped out a bunch of scenarios. Tell us what those scenarios are. We're getting now into the report itself. That we did about half an hour of context, but let's get right into this 1 billion tons report, which I encourage everybody to read, and we'll give you a link in the show notes.
Well, the thing with my models is that I'm not really a modeling guy. I've never studied it, and I'm more of a communicator. So when I want to find out something, I try to keep it so simple that I can explain it to anybody, and that's and the saying garbage in, garbage out. Well, if you put garbage into a model, you get garbage out. And the further that, if you have a very complex model that sounds fancy, sounds fine, sounds like, okay, this accounts for example, all the deployment risks that we discussed. But the more you have this stuff in the model, the more complex it is, the more prone the model actually becomes to what you put in there, your biases, your sources, your personal stuff that you don't even realize that you have. And
even if it's peer reviewed by a group of other modelers who do the same thing.
Probably. And the thing is that probably the model works, and that's enough for peer review. Because if the model works, you can publish that with these assumptions, a result happens. But the key is the assumptions. So, and this is another big discussion, but I've been doing some writing about this as well, that we are having these modeling exercises, for example, 100% renewables, modeling exercise, peer-reviewed, starts with these assumptions. This is the cheapest way for us to build a clean electricity grid. Sure. And that's correct. That goes through peer review. But then if you then take it to the kind of press release level, then it usually drops the first part of the thing with these assumptions. And it comes, this study says that 100% renewable way is cheaper than anything else. But the key is that okay, yes, it does say that with these assumptions, but what are the assumptions? If you assume that nuclear costs will go further through the roof, and renewables and batteries and everything else comes down, then obviously you're going to get that result.
So tell us about your assumptions.
Yeah.
I think you're saying you kept it simple, but
yeah, I kept it simple. Our assumption was that we tried to find out how much emissions would it save if instead of nuclear, coal plants would be shut down. And the justification for this is that they play a very similar role in the energy system. They mainly produce quite stable baseload firm capacity.
And I think nuclear in Germany does a fair amount of ramping up and down too, right?
Yeah. It does. It's one of the two places in Europe that France is another one. And contrary to common belief, that's possible. It's a licensing question mostly. You license the reactor to either do baseload or load following, and it has certain implications for how you operate the reactor.
Gotcha.
So that was the main assumptions. And then again, when there was no more coal to be replaced, then we started to replace natural gas. That was like a very simple way to see it. And then you just changed from shutting down nuclear into shutting down coal with the same amount of energy production per year. So that was the kind of, that's really simple. I even explained it to you and you're nodding.
Yeah, haven't quite told it.
Around. And we took the kind of most progressive energy model that we found, which is the Agora Energiewende carbon neutral Germany by 2050 at the time. Now they have a newer one, but we didn't get those numbers in time, which already has some really interesting assumptions. For example, energy use will go to less than one half by 2050. Some assuming there already.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that a little bit more because so your pathways, I think, were just keeping existing nuclear around. You had another pathway where you actually built a whole bunch more nuclear as well. Let's leave that one aside for now. And then you had a time travel scenario where you looked at what would have happened if they hadn't done unnecessary nuclear shutdowns. But one of them was on an energy abundance versus kind of an energy austerity pathway. But that brings up this question of like, is there any historic, not modeling precedents, but is there any historic precedents for a decrease in energy use like that doesn't just coincide with a catastrophe, a war, an economic recession? Like, you hear about Jensen's paradox that increasing energy efficiency just doesn't really have a big impact because then you just find other uses for the energy. So
Yeah.
is this just kind of like Amory Levin's fantasies, or do we have any real examples of energy reduction on that scale?
No. Not really.
That's a Rauli answer. I love your Rauli answers where it's just like, I'm going to give you a short answer as one syllable. No.
Because the thing is that you actually answered your own question.
I do that all the time, Rauli. I've got to stop.
But now you didn't notice. Maybe. The thing is that if you reduce energy use faster than you improve efficiency, efficiency improves about a bit less than 2% per year, I guess. So if you reduce it faster, it means that less stuff happens in your economy, which means that your economy goes down into a recession. And basically, you have not had nowhere near this kind of decreases in energy use without having a major crisis or a recession or stuff like that. And even then, it's usually just a couple of years because then the economy bounces back up with the shock gone and stuff like that. The amount of energy is by definition the amount of activities that people in your economy do. And the multiplier there is the efficiency in between that. So this implies that the German economy will shrink significantly in the next 30 years. And I mean, maybe the modelers were even aware of this assumption, and they are like, okay, well, that's fine. We are rich enough so we can become poorer. But in general, those experiments have never gone that well politically and geopolitically. So I would be very careful in assuming that energy demand will fall, at least not faster than efficiency is gaining. But even if it's the same, then your economy will be staying at the same level, which is not something that your economy right now is designed to do. It's designed to be growing, which is another discussion if that's a good thing or something else. But that's how it is. And if it's not doing what it's designed to do, problems start to happen.
It was, it was interesting. Like speaking about like unintended consequences of degrowth. Zion Leitz wrote a piece, one of my favorite things she ever wrote or has written about her experience, growing up in a working class, I think maybe it's Liverpool, an industrial kind of heartland in the 70s and 80s, like that her parents really thrived in as new immigrants. in a kind of social context that was pretty welcoming of immigrants. One where the economy is growing and doing well, and there's kind of room for everybody to thrive, and how economic recession of the 80s and Thatcherism and neoliberalism, et cetera, and offshoring, caused that economy to contract and deindustrialize, and the sort of social consequences of that, which were a lot more racism and xenophobia. So, I mean, it's just, again, talking about models and variables, the sort of unintended consequences that you're not thinking about. That just kind of came to my mind. But I think a lot of people, particularly in the green left, are like, well, that's good. It means we'll all work a few less days a week. We'll have a 20-hour work week. And expensive energy isn't such a bad thing, because then we'll use less of it. But particularly expensive electricity. You said something really interesting in the report about how, and this seems, when I read it, I was like, well, duh, of course. But what are the implications, Rauli, a leading question here, of expensive electricity to decarbonization? I didn't answer my own question. There you go.
Yeah. Well, the general assumption is that we will decarbonize our economy and energy use by electrifying. So moving stuff that now uses fuels into electricity, and then make that electricity cleanly. Okay? And that's a fine assumption, at least up to a point. There's some estimates how much of that you can actually do. It's about maybe half or 60% of energy use can be electrified. But the thing is that if you make the electricity very expensive, like in Germany, for example, I mean, the power itself can be quite cheap at the market. Certainly not now, but on windy days. But then you have so much fees and taxes and transmission costs and whatnot, that for the consumer, it becomes really expensive. That means that they have no incentive of replacing their oil burner or natural gas burner with electricity, because it will be much more expensive. So it does not happen. So by having high cost electricity, you are actually preventing the economy from electrifying, which then prevents it from decreasing emissions.
Okay, so in our kind of final 10 minutes or so, to the scenarios and the results that you got, I think the name of the report sort of says it all to a degree. 1 billion tons. To put that in context, as I thought Bill Gates did pretty well in his How to Avert a Climate Catastrophe book, every year humanity puts out about 50 billion tons of emissions. So, I mean, 1 billion tons, that doesn't sound like very much, Rauli, but that was the consequence of not shutting the German 6, I guess, right? You looked at some other measures, lives saved and costs and things like that. But yeah, walk us through a couple of these scenarios. And I guess these scenarios are really kind of policy recommendations. But let's jump into. We've done context, which has been awesome. I've learned a lot.
Part.
Yeah, but let's get into the meat of the report and sort of what your findings are. Go.
Yeah. Well, coal exit 10 years earlier. So instead of 2038 or 39, we get coal exit by 2028. That's, for me, a nice nice result, and actually something that the new legislation in Germany is kind of proposing that they need to do. I don't know how they're going to do it without nuclear, but then again. Similar thing with natural gas. Natural gas exit 10 years sooner, with saving the 6 reactors. You would prevent tens of thousands of lost lives and millions of lost work hours from happening due to air pollution. So
we saw that in Ontario, because I mean, when I was in Germany, I gave a little speech at the rally, and one of the things I said is that Ontario and Germany had the opposite sort of approach. In Ontario, we replaced coal with nuclear, and in Germany, they're kind of not necessarily doing the opposite, but they're keeping coal open a lot longer. And one of the big rationales for doing that in Ontario was that we saved about 1,000 lives a year. But interestingly, to me as a doctor, that also translated into tens of thousands of hospitalizations were averted per year.
Asthma for kids and all that.
And it was something like 40 or 50,000 emergency department visits that were avoided. And I started my medical career sort of at the very early stages of the coal phase. There's still a lot of coal on the grid, and there were other things as well. We cleaned up our auto emissions and stuff, but like just anecdotally, I feel like I saw a lot more asthma, and so that burden of disease is, just doctor certified. That stat is very real and very human. And when I emphasize that, I actually held up your report, your 1 billion tons report, when I was talking to Stefan Haufe, the German spokesperson for the COP delegation. When I mentioned those thousands of lives saved, he said, "Oh, but our pollution controls are some of the best in the world here in Europe. We've got really good scrubbers on our smokestacks." But it doesn't seem to make an impact, even when it's in that very human thing of premature deaths or kids with asthma. It's maddening.
Indeed. Talking about deaths, there was this paper just came out before we published our stuff, so I managed to implement it as well. Somebody did, I don't remember who it was, did a calculation, social cost of carbon. So how many extra heat-related fatalities we will have by 2100 per million ton of carbon dioxide emitted. And then I did the calculation for the 1 billion tons that the Germans choose to emit. And that's about 250,000 lives lost, mainly in the developing world, where it's hot. And that's only for heat.
That's for heat stress in the tropics, basically.
Which is just, at the same time, it's almost impossible for me to kind of think about that in a way. I cannot get any grip from it, and it also blows my mind. Like, what the hell? It's not just air pollution.
For that billion, what was it? Can you say the number again?
For the 1 billion tons, it was about 250,000. Now 226,000, I guess, is the total by 2100. Obviously, after that, more people will die. But
this is modeling, again, proviso, but I mean, certainly it's a potential, and we'll see kind of where we get to by 2100 in terms of degrees of warming. But things are getting a little spicy and hot in Pakistan and in British Columbia, Canada, where we hit 54 degrees, in the mountains in BC. Wow. Anyway, it's wild.
What else? Well, there's the economic costs. Obviously, it's quite clear that keeping nuclear open is if not then one of the cheapest way to add clean electricity. So that will cost billions and billions per year for the Germans. There's also the emissions trading system in place. So if you replace nuclear with increased coal burning, you have to buy emissions credits for that. And when we wrote this, the price was about 50 euros per ton. It was last summer, and now it's like 90. So when I say roughly 3 billion euros per year would be saved, it's now actually roughly 5.5 billion euros per year. That's almost enough to build your reactor per year, just from the emissions trading system.
This is something crazy this year, right? That gas has gotten so expensive that it's more economically viable to burn coal and spend 90 euros per ton than the alternative. Yeah,
and that's another market disruption, that there is much more demand for emissions credits because they are forced to burn coal.
In terms of this kind of degrowth plan and decreased energy use, I mean, the Germans are a bit kind of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy there by creating an energy system that very likely is going to disrupt their economy, create really high prices for themselves, drive down their ability to manufacture, and shrink their economy and energy use. I mean, maybe this is the ideal policy to achieve the 50% energy reduction goal.
Yeah, but no. Because the people of Germany have not been told this. They don't want this. And at some point, some of the politicians will realize that this is something that they can blame on the stuff that Germany will be going through. And they will take advantage of that. These will be mainly the populist ones. So this will not just be a nice degrowth harmonizing with the nature Germany. This will be the Germany that will have a lot a lot of pissed off people who are not seeing improvements in their lives, not seeing improvements in their communities, are losing their jobs, are getting paid less and stuff like that. Because this is a basic pillar of how your society works. As I explained, the amount of energy that you have. If you screw that up, the economy will suffer. Obviously, the politicians will try to look for blame anywhere else than in their own actions, because that's already stuff that is happening in Germany. But there's only up to a point that you can successfully do that. You can fool one person all his life, or you can fool a nation for some time, but you cannot fool everybody all the time, I guess.
I frequently say that, my biggest fear around climate change, at least in the short term, is less the physical impacts, but more the sociological and political ones. The xenophobia, the kind of anti-immigration, anti-refugee thing, who becomes the scapegoats. But now it's not only my fear around climate, but my fear on, the consequences of poor energy policies as well. And the way that those things are going to compound together in terms of politics, I think that there's a real risk around the world for dangerous, I'm not against populism in its entirety, because I think it's good to have policies that are populist from the perspective of, helping people improve their lives and for their wages to go up, and those, that's kind of a populism I can get behind. But there's certainly a dangerous populism which is about scapegoating and profiting off of people's anger, and not necessarily directing that anger where it belongs, but usually at disadvantaged people or ethnic minorities, etc.
I mean, if you imagine this kind of situation, then what will be the social license for more climate action in that kind of country, or in the European Union, where it means for the people even more of the bad stuff, even more expensive energy bills, even more expensive everything, basically, because everything comes from energy. And at some point, some politician will say that, okay, screw this, vote me, and I will take this away. I will make it better. I will let you drive your cars and stuff like that. So,
right.
Yeah, and there goes the climate project.
And to date, I mean, I guess Europe's just a very wealthy place. There's enough of a buffer, especially in places like Germany, of just excessive wealth that they can.
You can ask the poorest 20% if they think that. For example, I mean, that's one of the key issues here, is that the politicians who make the decisions, they are in the top 10% of wealth. They don't see any of the effects of their policies in their personal lives. They can pay a cappuccino per day for more expensive or organic or something like that. They don't see, but they also don't see what the effect will be for the kind of lowest 10% or 20% of the population, let alone in the developing world, where this, I mean, another level. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, maybe just in closing, because we're kind of hitting the hour mark, where my producer starts to get a little angry at me if I go too far over. So one of the last things of interest in the report, many interesting things, but was this, and again, it's probably politically not going to happen unless, there's some visionary politics, but this idea of restarting reactors that either have already been shut down, or maybe these German 6, if they're mothballed, could potentially be restarted. My impression is that, they've now got a more ambitious coal phase out of 2030. I think you and I have some skepticism about that, but my impression is that when they close a coal plant, they're pretty likely to very carefully mothball it. And my impression, and again, this may not be backed by reality, but I think I remember seeing the Philipsburg plant cooling tower getting demolished very quickly after the plant was shut down, is that when they shut down a nuclear plant, it's kind of well, let's put a wrench in the gears so that it could never be restarted. Is that accurate, or am my biases getting ahead of me here in terms of, because you do talk about, is there a potential for either restarting the fleet that's already been shut down, or maybe these German 6 that, if the politics change, the energy crisis gets brutal, and there's a reconsideration of nuclear, certainly the German politicians I talked to at COP were like, no, we're going to drive a nail through the heart of this. It's done. It's over. There is no stepping back from this. But yeah, what in terms of your looking at that in this report, what's your sense?
Well, then the nuclear industry is precarious in this way that it's really easy to kill, and it's very hard to reborn, give it a rebirth. We in the report we actually assumed that none of the already closed down reactors will be restarted, because there might be theoretical possibilities that some of them would, but as you said, the cooling towers getting blown, perhaps somebody went with a big drill into the pressure vessel or something like that. So that was just, I did a good discussion with an industry insider about this possibility, and he was like, I wouldn't count on any of them being able to restart. But the thing is, even with the German 6, you would probably need to have some kind of maintenance, refueling, because you would have to order new fuel, for example, that you don't have. So even and there I calculated something like a year and a half of break, like offline time for them before they could be restarted. But if you talk about the kind of scenario called energy abundance instead of scarcity, so there we actually did advanced reactor program for Germany. Starting as soon as imaginable, like if the political situation completely, for example, due to the energy crisis or something like that, completely flips, and enough of the state kind of political trust can be given to restart the program, then maybe some reactors would be coming online in this decade, like small modular reactors or stuff like that. And there we actually get into this kind of IPCC compliant scenario, which sees the German fleet growing 4 times from the 2010 levels, which is what needs to happen for the 1.5 degree scenarios to have to like roadmap to happen. So we did that, and all the other assumptions were left the same, and well, it means that German energy demand only drops by maybe a quarter or 20% by 2050, instead of dropping to more than or less than half of what it was in 2020. Yeah. So even I mean, and this is the scale of things and the scale of kind of things that will happen because of past mistakes. Is that even if we have this kind of ridiculous sounding on the face of it right now in the current political regime, a new nuclear program that starts to build as much advanced reactors in Germany as possible, they're still screwed, especially in the 2030s to 2040s, where these are not yet coming online, but they have already closed down their nuclear power plants, and maybe they're they pretty much have to close down their coal power plants by 2030 as well. So in the 30s, Germans will have not that much energy. Who's going to supply them? Poland? Poland has a big fleet of coal plants as well. Obviously, they're trying to build nuclear, but
your neighbor Sweden just had to run their oil-fired plant, I think, to energy for Poland or something crazy like that.
Yeah, Poland had an emergency, so they agreed to start their oil-fired. I think that's like 600 megawatts or something like that. So it's a big one. But yeah, and it's only winter is just coming. So wow.
All right.
Let's see.
All right.
And then you have the case that is Belgium, which is also aiming to close down 6 gigawatts. So you have 14 gigawatts of stable, reliable, clean electricity going away in the next 4 years from Europe.
In the midst of an energy crisis.
Yeah, in the midst of an energy crisis. And then they are having difficulties building and permitting new gas power turbines in Belgium. And well, Nord Stream 2 has been in quite a bit of trouble. It might take some time to get that online. And so, wow, interesting times. I'm lucky to be here in Finland with a fixed priced electricity deal. So and reasonably isolated. I mean, we will be having good news. Olkiluoto 3 is coming online in just a couple of months, connecting to the grid in February. If we stay on target,
Right.
let's see.
Wow. Okay, Rauli, it was a pleasure, man. It was great meeting you in Glasgow, and fun to
Yeah.
do this podcast thing with you again. Here's the report. I very rarely, we have the video kind of portion of Decouple on YouTube now, so I get to hold up a report on screen. It's kind of exciting. But yeah, I feel like Oprah, like making a recommendation for a great book I read. So anyway, check out the 1 Billion Tons report. We will post the link to the digital version. There's lots of really great quotes and really great graphs and things like that. It's really, really well put together. And Rauli, anything else? Where can our listeners find you, learn more about what you do, buy your books, etc.?
Well, thinkatom.net is the website where I publish all of my kind of publicly available studies and reports nowadays. I run also a blog that mostly is just for me to keep diaries from COPs, which I did this time around as well. Just every day I write a piece of what happened during that day. It's called kaikenhuippu.com, so it might be a little bit hard to spell. It's originally Finnish, so that's why the name. Obviously, you can search me on Amazon to find my books and stuff like that. And yeah, feel free to shoot me an email if you want to ask something or comment on something or help me somehow.
Sounds good. Okay, Rauli, enjoy teaching your capoeira class.
Will
Thank
do.
you for squeezing me in before that.
Yeah, don't sweat it. It's all good.